The island had been abandoned for years, at least that's what the maps said. The soft lapping of the ocean against the jagged rocks and the swaying palms under the dim light of dusk made it seem untouched, serene, as though the world had simply forgotten about it. There was no trace of humanity here, no trace of anything resembling a living being. Then he saw her. At first, it was nothing more than a flash of movement, the faintest silhouette caught between the shadows of the trees. His boat had been drifting aimlessly for days, the engine sputtering out just hours ago. Now, stranded on a forgotten island in the middle of nowhere, the waves pulling him closer to the shore, he was already too tired to care about how he'd ended up here. But when he saw her, her pale skin illuminated in the fading twilight, her long, dark hair clinging to her face like a veil, it was as if the very world held its breath. She stood at the edge of the water, the hem of her strange, silver dress soaked by the tide, her eyes wide, searching, lost. His heart stilled in his chest. Something about her, it didn't feel right. She didn't belong here, not like this. His first instinct was to shout, to warn her to stay back, but the words caught in his throat. She didn't look like she was from anywhere he knew. Hey! His voice was hoarse, raw from days without water or proper food. Are you all right? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes locked onto his with a strange intensity. It was unnerving, the way she held his gaze as if she could see right through him, to some hidden part of himself he hadn't even known existed. Help! She murmured, her voice faint, barely more than a whisper carried by the wind. The words cut through the quiet, sending a chill through his body that had nothing to do with the evening air. He stumbled forward, unsure of whether to run toward her or away from her. She wasn't alone. There was something about her, something alien. And that was when he saw it. She had no shoes. Her feet were bare, but it wasn't just the dirt on them that made them look wrong, it was the shape. The angle of her feet, too delicate, too slender to be human. He didn't know what she was, but it was becoming painfully clear she was no ordinary woman. Who are you? He demanded, forcing his voice to hold steady. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around as though searching for something she couldn't find. Finally, her lips parted again, but this time her words came more slowly, her accent thick, unfamiliar. I lost. Left behind. His mind raced. Left behind? His first instinct was to call it a delusion, some kind of fever dream, but her presence felt too real, too tangible, like a threat he couldn't name. What do you mean? He took a step closer, careful, hesitant, his hand reaching for the knife strapped to his belt. It wasn't out of fear of her yet, but of what she might be connected to. The woman raised her head slightly, as if she heard something he didn't. A flicker of tension crossed her face. Not safe. They come. He stared at her, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure if it was the strange words, her appearance, or the way she seemed so utterly out of place on this island, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This wasn't just an island, this wasn't just an accident. There was a reason she was here, and a reason she had been abandoned. A harsh, dry cough racked his chest. His throat burned with each shallow breath, the hunger gnawing at his insides. This woman, however, seemed to have no trouble with the heat or the air. She looked as pristine as when he first saw her, not even a speck of sand on her. Who are you? His voice cracked as he asked again, more urgently this time. No name. Her words grew more fragmented. I am not one of them. Left. Alone. She took a cautious step toward him. Her eyes flickered toward the sky for a moment, as though something unseen were calling to her, something only she could hear. He frowned. You're not making sense. She took another step forward, this time closer than he expected. Do not trust them. No time. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as smoke, and just as suffocating. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to find his boat and leave the island, but something about her words, something about the desperate, fragile way she held herself together, made it impossible to walk away. He couldn't leave her here alone. Why were you left behind? he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Her face twisted with pain. Or was it regret? The answer came out unbidden before he could stop her. They will come. For you, too. The world around him seemed to grow colder, the island no longer a sanctuary but a trap. His mind raced, trying to process her cryptic warnings. Whoever or whatever had left her here, abandoned her like a broken toy. There was something dark lurking in the background, something far beyond his comprehension. But he wasn't alone anymore. And now, either was she. A sudden noise from the trees behind them made him spin around. A rustling, too purposeful to be the wind. The woman's eyes widened. They are here. And that's when he knew. Whatever she was, whatever had brought her to this forsaken place, she wasn't the only danger. The island had gone eerily silent. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks had receded into a soft, almost imperceptible murmur. The wind that had once stirred the leaves and the palm fronds now seemed to hold its breath. Even the insects had fallen quiet. And in the middle of this unsettling stillness, all he could hear was his own heartbeat and the woman's soft, labored breathing. He hadn't realized how close she was, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her skin when she stepped forward, her delicate form barely a silhouette against the dimming sky. Her presence was almost too much to bear, too tangible, as though something immense had descended upon him, something that demanded his attention, his protection. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling, but not from fear. No, there was something else. Desperation, maybe? Who? His throat tightened as he spoke. Who's coming? But she didn't answer. Her eyes had narrowed, focused on something beyond him, some threat just out of sight. The pulse of danger hung in the air like the promise of a storm. He turned quickly, scanning the island's edge. The trees, dense and sprawling, were still and lifeless in the creeping dusk. No movement. No sign of anything. But that didn't ease the knot in his stomach. If anything, it made it worse. "Who are you?" he asked again, the words coming out raw, urgent. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, her hand grazing the blade of grass next to her, as if seeking some kind of comfort. When her eyes met his, it was with a level of sadness that he couldn't quite place. "I am not from here," she said softly, her words slow, measured. "I am lost. Left behind." The way she spoke the last words made his heart drop. There was no self-pity in her voice, no sorrow. Just a cold, unyielding acceptance of her fate. Whatever had happened to her, she had made peace with it, or at least, it appeared that way. "You keep saying that," he murmured, stepping closer, drawn by her presence, by something in her eyes that made him want to understand. "Left behind by who?" Her eyes flickered for just a second, too quick for him to catch, but it was there. The flicker of fear. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the sound of something breaking through the underbrush stopped her. It wasn't the soft scurrying of a small creature, it was heavy, deliberate. He tensed. "What is that?" She looked at him, her face now filled with a clarity he hadn't seen before. The uncertainty, the exhaustion, it was gone. "Them," she said simply, her gaze drifting toward the trees. "They come now." The words settled on him like an iron weight. "Who the hell are they?" Before she could answer, the first figure emerged from the shadows, tall, impossibly tall, with dark, sharp features that looked too angular to belong to any human he'd ever seen. The skin of the figure shimmered in the low light, almost metallic, its movements fluid, unnatural. A second one followed, and then a third. Their faces were cloaked in shadows, but the unmistakable sense of malevolence that radiated from them was enough to send a chill down his spine. "Shit!" he whispered under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. But the woman, she wasn't frightened. No, her posture straightened, her back stiffened, and despite the danger that loomed before them, she almost looked resigned. As if she had seen this all before. "They're here for me," she said quietly, her voice almost a mournful note in the growing darkness. "But they will take you too, if you stay." The last words hung in the air, thick with warning. But the way she said them, so matter-of-fact, so detached, made it clear that she wasn't speaking out of concern for him. She wasn't worried for her own safety either. She seemed to accept whatever fate awaited her. He swallowed, his mind racing. The figures, whatever they were moving closer, slowly, as if savoring the moment before they closed in. They weren't in any hurry. Not yet. Why did you come here? His voice was rough. Desperation, panic, it was all bubbling to the surface now. He couldn't help it. He had to know why. Why had she come to him? Why had she appeared, so suddenly, when his world had already been ripped apart by circumstances he couldn't control? Her gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate. I thought you could help me, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. He flinched, unsure how to respond to the unexpected vulnerability. I don't even know who you are, he said sharply, frustration clouding his tone. But there was no answer. She simply stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures, as if she had already made a decision. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the tree line. The sound of the approaching figures was louder now, closer. He could hear their breathing, almost mechanical, echoing in the stillness. Don't come any closer, he warned, the words more for himself than for them. The woman's eyes locked on his. She looked different now. A spark of something human, something real, flickered behind those alien eyes. I have to go with them, she whispered. And in that moment, he realized, whatever had brought her here, whatever fate had crossed their paths, it wasn't something either of them could escape. They were both already trapped. The air was thick with tension, as if the island itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his hand still gripping the woman's arm, though he barely noticed it now. His mind was consumed by the figures closing in on them, their movements unnervingly deliberate. The woman, despite the danger, wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, the setting sun casting long shadows across her face, accentuating the lines of sorrow etched there. Why are they coming for you? He demanded, his voice louder now, desperate. What do they want? She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. It's not about me, she said, her voice steady but hollow. It's about them. They will stop at nothing to reclaim what was lost. Reclaim? He repeated the word, a knot forming in his stomach. What the hell does that mean? Her gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of something human beneath the cold veneer of her alien features. You don't understand, she whispered, almost to herself. I never wanted to be here. I never wanted any of this. But I made a choice. The figures were close now, so close he could hear the soft, eerie hum of their bodies moving, like a swarm of insects made flesh. Tall, angular beings, with dark, glossy skin that reflected the dying light in sharp, unsettling patterns. Their eyes were cold, unfeeling orbs, and as they stepped forward, their very presence seemed to push back the very air around them. He stepped in front of her, instinctively positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline flooding his veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to. For her. Why don't you just leave? He growled, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, her or them. What the hell do you want with her? The nearest figure raised its arm, its movement precise and slow, as though savoring the moment. The others flanked it, standing in a perfect formation, their collective silence oppressive. The woman didn't flinch. They won't leave until they get what they're after. Which is what? He pressed. Her eyes met his then, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the whole world slowed down. He could see the vulnerability in her face, the tension coiled beneath the surface of her calm. My blood, she said, her words soft but devastating. They need it. He blinked, his confusion only growing. What? They can't function without it. Without my blood. I'm the key to their survival. They lost it once, and now they're trying to reclaim it. The weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. Blood. Survival. Something in her story didn't add up, but the fear in her eyes, he couldn't ignore that. Whatever this was, it was much bigger than either of them. A low, metallic hum vibrated through the ground beneath his feet, a resonance that felt unnatural, like the pulsing of something alive, and in that moment, he realized it wasn't just the figures that posed a threat. It was the very island itself, reacting to their presence. "They won't stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep running. I won't survive." Something about that broke him. Not just the way her voice cracked, but the finality of it. She wasn't asking for help, wasn't pleading for mercy. She had already resigned herself to whatever fate awaited her. He felt a surge of anger. Not just at them, not just at whatever had brought her here, but at himself. "What do you mean you won't survive?" he spat. "I'm not just going to stand here and let them." But she cut him off, her eyes fierce now, her voice low. "You don't understand," she hissed, her hand brushing against his arm with surprising strength. "You think this is about me? This is about what I am. What I could have been." She glanced back at the approaching figures, and he could see the fear in her eyes, masked by something darker. "I never wanted this, but I can't undo what I've done." He didn't have time to respond, because that's when they struck. The first figure lunged forward with a speed that defied all logic, its body twisting in unnatural angles, its eyes locked on the woman. Without thinking, he pushed her aside, feeling the sharp, cold energy radiating from the figure as it missed its target by mere inches. The air hummed with tension as the others closed in, their movements synchronized, mechanical. He stumbled backward, drawing his knife, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. These creatures weren't human. He wasn't even sure if they could die the same way he could. A low growl rumbled from the figure's throat, its mouth parting, revealing a row of needle-sharp teeth. "You will not stop what is ours," it hissed. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. His grip tightened around the hilt of his knife. His breath quickened, his heart hammering against his ribs. But then, through the blur of movement, he saw something that made the blood in his veins run cold. The woman stepped forward, her posture straight, eyes cold and unblinking. The figures stopped, just a few feet away, as though they were waiting for her command. "Leave." "No," she said, her voice sharp, commanding. The figures didn't move, but something shifted in the air, something that made him feel as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The atmosphere grew colder, darker. Then, as if on cue, they retreated. For a moment, everything was still. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked, his voice trembling, the adrenaline still coursing through him. "You could have." "I am what they need," she said, her voice hard now, distant. "If they had killed me, they would have destroyed themselves." The gravity of her words sank in. Whatever this was, whatever she was, it was more than just survival. It was survival for an entire species. He felt a chill creeping down his spine, but there was no time to process. The figures were gone for now, but the island wasn't. And neither was the woman. As she turned toward him, her expression softened, just slightly. "You should leave. It's not safe here anymore." But he didn't move. He couldn't. She had just told him something that shook him to his core. She wasn't just a woman caught in a strange fate, she was the key to an intergalactic war. And for the first time since they met, he understood what he was really up against. The island had never felt more oppressive, its humid air thick with a quiet that pressed against him like a physical force. The sun had long dipped beneath the horizon, leaving only a bruised sky tinged with the last whispers of daylight. Shadows stretched over the jungle, deepening with each passing second, and the oppressive silence that followed the retreat of the alien figures seemed to stretch on forever. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at her. Her back was to him, her silhouette a dark contrast against the dying light, her body still but tense. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the confrontation behind. It was as though she had become a part of the island, a fixture in the unforgiving landscape, one more mystery to unravel. For the first time, he noticed the way the air around her seemed to bend, vibrating with some subtle, inhuman energy. It was hard to pinpoint. But it was there, undeniable, just beneath the surface. She wasn't just some stranded alien. She was more. The silence between them was thick, full of unspoken words. He wanted to break it, wanted to scream for her to explain everything. But he couldn't bring himself to speak, not yet. He had questions. So many questions. And he wasn't sure he wanted the answers. Finally, she turned to face him, the faintest hint of weariness in her eyes. But it was more than that. There was a kind of resignation there, a deep acceptance of something he couldn't quite grasp. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no sound came out. It was as if the weight of the question itself had stilled her. "I couldn't," she said finally, her voice rough, as if the words were too heavy for her to speak. "I thought I could protect you. But I—" She cut herself off, shaking her head slightly, her eyes distant as if she were seeing something far beyond him. "The truth is dangerous." "Dangerous?" His voice rose, thick with frustration. "You're dangerous, you know that?" She met his eyes then, and the sharpness of her gaze hit him harder than any words could. "You think I'm dangerous now?" she asked, her voice quieter, but more intense than he'd ever heard it. "I've only ever wanted to survive. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But now, I have no choice." She took a step closer, her body almost magnetic in its pull. "You're the one who came looking for answers. But now you've found them. And the price of that knowledge is more than you can afford." He swallowed hard, trying to process the gravity of her words. Her eyes were so damn sure of themselves, like she was pleading with him to turn away, to forget everything she had just revealed. But it was too late. He couldn't forget. Not now. Not ever. "What does that mean?" His words felt like a betrayal of everything he thought he knew about this place, about her. She reached up and touched the side of his face, a gentle motion that almost shattered the hard edges of his emotions. Her touch was cool, like something otherworldly, yet it held an unexpected warmth. The kind that calmed more than it comforted. "I didn't want you to know. Not like this. But they're coming. They're always coming. And if you stay, you'll be dragged into this war too. Whether you want it or not." The air shifted again, rippling with an intensity he couldn't ignore. It was like the island itself had shifted its stance, as though everything was teetering on the edge of an irrevocable decision. The alien figures had retreated, but their presence lingered, lingering like a bad dream that refused to let him go. He could still feel the weight of their eyes, the cold certainty of their motives. The woman beside him, she wasn't just a prisoner of their pursuit. She was the catalyst, the very reason they were hunting her. "Why didn't you fight them back?" he demanded, his frustration leaking through. "I couldn't," she replied simply. "If I did, everyone, would have been lost." She took a breath, her eyes flickering with something darker, deeper. "They're not just after me. They want the blood I carry. The blood that can change everything." His pulse quickened. He wanted to believe he understood what she meant, but the pieces of this puzzle refused to fit. Every answer she gave only raised new questions, and the deeper he dug, the more elusive the truth seemed. "I don't know if I can protect you," he said, the weight of his own words crashing into him. "I don't know if I can protect us from them." She nodded, as though she'd been expecting that. "You can't protect us from everything. But you can help me stop them." Her voice was raw, stripped of all the distance she had once put between them. "You're the only one who can." His heart raced. He didn't want to be caught up in this. He didn't want to fight a war he didn't understand. He didn't want to be involved in a battle he hadn't asked for. But now, it was too late. He already was. She was already pulling him into it, whether he was ready or not. "Tell me what I need to do," he said, the words coming from somewhere deep within him, from a place he didn't recognize. He hadn't come here to get caught in some alien war. But for her? For the woman who had become something more to him than he could admit? He would fight. He would do whatever it took. She stepped back, her face softening just a fraction. "There's no going back now," she whispered. You've made your choice. And then, from the darkness behind them, came the unmistakable sound of a heavy footfall, followed by a chilling, inhuman laugh. They weren't alone anymore.